Hello, friends. Today we have an extremely interesting, though disturbing topic. What would happen if Russia won the war against Ukraine? How would it change Ukraine, Europe, and the world? So, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click on the bell to not miss new episodes, and leave your thoughts in the comments. At the beginning of the war in 2022, Russia planned a lightning strike on Kyiv and other major cities, trying to quickly capture the capital and break Ukraine's will to resist. However, unexpectedly for many analysts, Ukrainian troops, volunteers, and civilians stood up to defend the country with unprecedented strength. The first months of the war brought a series of major battles, such as the battles for Kyiv, Kharkiv, and Mariupol. Now imagine what would have happened if this resistance had not been sufficient. After a successful invasion in the north and southeast, Russia won a key victory in the battle for Kyiv in the first 2 weeks of the war. The losses of Ukrainian forces were enormous, and the international community remained uncertain due to internal crises and fear of escalation. The fall of Kyiv paved the way for the total occupation of most of Ukraine. One of the key battles in this alternative reality was the battle for Kharkiv. While in real life Kharkiv survived, in this scenario the city was trapped. Russian troops surrounded the city, using heavy artillery and airstrikes to completely destroy the defenses. After 3 weeks of heavy fighting, Kharkiv surrendered, and its residents found themselves under occupation. Western countries, including the United States and the European Union, initially limited their response to sanctions and diplomatic statements. However, due to political differences, the rise of populism, and the growing fear of Russia's use of nuclear weapons, NATO did not activate direct military assistance. This left Ukraine alone against the Russian offensive. In the south, Russia quickly occupied Kherson and Zaporizhia, allowing it to gain control of strategic ports and parts of the Black Sea. The offensive on Odessa was the last blow to the Ukrainian Navy, which had lost all possibility of resistance. Ukraine's naval bases were completely destroyed, and Russia gained control of the sea lanes in the region. The occupation of western Ukraine proved particularly difficult for Russian troops. Lviv, the historical center of Ukrainian culture and national identity, became a center of fierce resistance. Despite the occupation, a network of underground organizations and partisan groups continued to operate here, receiving support from abroad. Western countries secretly supplied weapons and equipment to the partisans operating in the Carpathians through Poland and Romania. The guerrilla war in the mountains, forests, and small towns of western Ukraine lasted for years, causing significant losses to the Russian occupation forces. With the fall of Lviv, the whole of Ukraine was under occupation. Resistance continued only in the form of guerrilla warfare in the Carpathians and western forests, where small groups fought against the occupying forces. After Russia's victory, repressions began in Ukraine. A huge part of the population was deported to Siberia or Eastern Russia. Ukrainian culture was banned, and the language was pushed out of all public institutions and schools. Western sanctions imposed on Russia failed to stop its expansion, and soon the Kremlin's attention turned to other post-Soviet countries. Georgia, Moldova, and even the Baltic states began to prepare for a possible threat. Despite the military victory over Ukraine, Russia faced strong economic pressure due to Western sanctions. Disconnection from the SWIFT international financial system, blocking of Western investments in export markets, and restrictions on the supply of high-tech goods have seriously hit the country's economy. Industry, including defense, which was dependent on Western technology and components, began to experience a severe shortage of resources. China also decided to seize the moment. The distraction of Western attention to the European theater of operations allowed Beijing to intensify its activities around Taiwan. China began conducting large-scale military exercises in the Taiwan Strait and prepared an air and naval blockade, increasing diplomatic pressure on Taipei. This created a new hotspot in world politics to which the United States was forced to respond by weakening its focus on events in Europe. The international community is faced with a new geopolitical alignment. NATO is trying to strengthen its borders in the West, but the political crisis and China's growing influence are making the alliance less effective. The United States, experiencing an economic crisis, cannot interfere in events in Europe. The world is gradually returning to the Cold War, where Russia and China are becoming the main rivals of the Western powers. Beijing supported Russia politically, but remained neutral in terms of military assistance. At the same time, China used the situation to promote its own interests in Southeast Asia and increased its military presence in the Taiwan Strait, taking advantage of the fact that the West was busy with Russian aggression. Countries in Africa and Latin America have also responded to the new global order. Some African states, dependent on Russian weapons and resources, supported the Kremlin's new policy, viewing Russia as an alternative to Western domination. In Latin America, particularly in Venezuela and Cuba, new alliances have strengthened against the backdrop of anti-American sentiment. At the same time, however, some countries, such as Brazil, have begun to cooperate more actively with the United States and the EU in an effort to balance the influence of Russia and China. After seizing Ukraine, Russia quickly established a harsh occupation regime. A new puppet government was then formed, operating under the direct control of the Kremlin. Ukraine's democratic institutions were destroyed, the political opposition was eliminated, and leading Ukrainian politicians either disappeared or ended up in Russian prisons. Resistance in Ukraine remained only at the level of underground partisan movements, but these movements had no chance of a long-term struggle due to the constant control of the FSB special services. Ukraine no longer had an independent government. All decisions were made by the Kremlin, and any form of resistance was brutally suppressed. Despite the external expansion, Russia itself began to experience an internal crisis. Economic sanctions and the war with Ukraine have seriously undermined the Russian economy, causing a sharp deterioration in the quality of life of the population. Rapidly rising prices for food and basic necessities, business shutdowns, and job losses have led to massive protests in major cities and remote regions. People who had previously supported the government began to feel deeply disillusioned, which increased psychological pressure. Depression and despair became the norm among the population, especially amid reports of the huge costs of the war, which directly affected social programs and public services. The prolonged war with Ukraine has taken a heavy toll on the Russian military. Cemeteries for the dead appeared in every city, and families who lost their loved ones began to oppose the war. The authorities tried to conceal the true numbers of casualties, but the return of wounded soldiers and prisoners of war caused an explosion of discontent. In many regions, movements of mothers of fallen soldiers began to form, demanding an end to the war and accountability from the government. These actions increased social tensions and created powerful psychological pressure on the regime. Separatist sentiment began to grow in remote regions of Russia, such as the Far East, Siberia, and the North Caucasus. Local elites and populations were dissatisfied with the policies of the center, which focused all resources on the war, leaving their regions in economic decline. Demands for greater autonomy and financial independence became louder, and protests for secession began in some regions. This further exacerbated Russia's internal destabilization, threatening to split the country and creating new challenges for the central government. Direct political control was exercised through new intelligence services modeled after the Soviet KGB. Local authorities were overrun with Russian officials who were responsible for the so-called normalization of public life under the new regime. Russification of Ukraine became a priority of the new government. The Russian language completely replaced Ukrainian from all spheres of life. In schools, children were forced to study Russian history and literature, which praised the common past of Russia and Ukraine as brotherly peoples. Monuments of Ukrainian culture, such as monuments to Shevchenko, were demolished and replaced with statues of Lenin or Pushkin. All attempts to preserve national identity were persecuted as manifestations of Ukrainian nationalism, which was now considered a crime. However, Western Ukraine became a center of cultural resistance. Local intellectuals and clergy organized underground schools where children were taught the Ukrainian language and history. They secretly published Ukrainian books, leaflets, and newspapers calling for the continuation of the struggle. Despite the harsh repression, the locals did their best to preserve their national identity. Russian troops tried to suppress this movement, but resistance continued at the cultural level. The Ukrainian diaspora, especially in Poland, Canada, and the United States, actively supported the resistance in Western Ukraine. Financial assistance, diplomatic pressure on Western governments, and the dissemination of information about Russian crimes in the region helped strengthen the partisan movement. International support provided the occupied region with additional resources for long-term resistance, and ties with the diaspora allowed for the creation of channels for the supply of weapons, medicines, and other necessary materials. Therefore, the Russification of Western Ukraine was much more difficult for the occupation authorities than in other territories. Here, every step of the occupiers was met with resistance, from the destruction of Ukrainian monuments to the introduction of the Russian language in schools. Local residents massively sabotaged the Russian authorities' attempts to impose new rules. Monuments of Ukrainian culture and religion, in the form of books, continued to be symbols of resistance and the struggle for independence. Russian authorities tried to intensify repression, but resistance remained strong. In addition to partisan resistance, Western Ukraine became the source of a huge wave of refugees. Thousands of people fleeing Russian repression crossed the borders to Poland, Romania, and other European countries. This caused a significant humanitarian crisis in the region as international organizations tried to help millions of Ukrainians who had lost their homes. Western countries were faced with a massive wave of refugees, which increased political tensions and sharpened the debate on the need for more decisive action against Russia. After the occupation, Russia imposed strict control over the media. All TV channels were changed to Russian ones, and the internet was under constant surveillance. Social networks and mobile phones of Ukrainians were monitored, and any attempts to organize resistance through digital platforms were severely suppressed. Total censorship was established in the country, and even small acts of resistance could lead to arrests. Russia also tried to establish control over Ukrainian religious institutions. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Kiev Patriarchate was banned, and the Moscow Patriarchate became the only allowed religious institution. This led to protests by the clergy and faithful, who were also persecuted. Churches that did not submit to the new government were closed and their property confiscated. Meanwhile, as repression in Ukraine continued, Russia was sinking deeper into an internal economic crisis. Western sanctions, which deprived the country of access to European markets, halted the development of key sectors of the economy, from the oil and gas complex to technological production. Russia's foreign exchange reserves began to deplete, and budget deficits grew due to the costs of the war and the occupation regime. In response to rising prices and unemployment, mass protests broke out in major Russian cities. The Kremlin was forced to intensify repression, not only against the opposition, but also against the disgruntled population. Ukraine's economy quickly fell into a state of ruin. Most Ukrainian enterprises were nationalized and transferred to Russian companies. Agriculture, once the breadbasket of Europe, now worked to meet Russian needs. Lack of Western investment and international isolation led to massive unemployment. Infrastructure was destroyed by the fighting, and rebuilding was not part of the occupiers' plans. Ukrainians found themselves in a social and economic crisis reminiscent of the darkest times of the Soviet occupation. Large-scale military operations in Ukraine have led to catastrophic environmental consequences. Contamination of rivers and soil with chemicals from destroyed equipment, oil spills from attacked ports on the Black Sea, and the destruction of forests during shelling have made large areas uninhabitable. In some regions, the environmental crisis has become so severe that thousands of people have been forced to leave their homes due to water and air pollution. Ukraine's energy resources, such as coal, gas, and nuclear power plants, were nationalized and worked exclusively to meet Russia's needs. Food exports to Europe were halted, leading to food shortages and price increases across Europe. In Ukraine itself, ration cards and the black market became the only way to survive. Mass emigration to neighboring countries turned the borders with Poland and Romania into huge refugee camps. Life under occupation became unbearable due to constant control by the Russian military and special services. The streets were patrolled by Russian soldiers, the FSB was engaged in exposing any suspicious persons, and partisan groups operating in the Carpathians and other forested areas were subjected to brutal repression. Nevertheless, the resistance continued, with small groups of Ukrainians committing sabotage, organizing underground radio stations, and publishing anti-Russian leaflets. Russia did not stop after capturing Ukraine. The next step was Moldova, which has long had a conflict with Russian-backed Transnistria. Under the guise of protecting the Russian-speaking population, Russia conducted a military operation that quickly ended in the annexation of Moldova. Chisinau was captured within days. After the annexation of Moldova, Russia faced pressure from Romania, which tried to increase its influence in the region by protecting ethnic Romanians. However, NATO did not support Romania's active actions, and the conflict escalated to localized border clashes between Romanian and Russian forces. However, Russia's further expansion into Moldova took place in the face of increasing economic exhaustion. Western sanctions did not allow Russia to easily finance its wars, so the Kremlin was forced to turn to friendly countries such as Iran and Venezuela for resources. China provided only limited economic support in an attempt to maintain a balance between the West and Russia, but it was not enough. This has led to significant social and economic difficulties in Russia itself, which has called into question its ability to continue its aggressive foreign policy. Next, the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, came under attack. Russia tried to use its strategy of internal destabilization by spreading propaganda and supporting pro-Russian separatist movements among Russian-speaking minorities in these countries. However, unlike in other regions, Russia's aggression here was met with an immediate response from NATO. In accordance with Article 5 of the treaty, the alliance quickly activated its forces by deploying military units and equipment to the Baltic states. The United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, and other key allies sent their troops to bolster the region's defense. This demonstrative show of NATO's collective defense deterred Russia from open military aggression against Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. However, tensions remained high due to cyber attacks, disinformation, and Russia's attempts to destabilize political processes in the region. The Kremlin's aggressive policy has led to a significant militarization of the borders, but Russia has not dared to go into a full-scale conflict, knowing that it could provoke an immediate and powerful response from the entire alliance. At the same time, China did not limit itself to political support for Russia. Beijing used the chaos in Europe to promote its One Belt, One Road initiative. China actively offered loans and investments to countries that suffered from the consequences of the war and those under sanctions. This allowed China not only to strengthen economic ties, but also to expand its political influence in the region, which had lost contact with Western markets due to the economic consequences of the war. After the Baltics, the Kremlin expanded its aggression to the Caucasus. Georgia, which lost Abkhazia and South Ossetia after the 2008 war, has once again become a target of Russian aggression. New Russian military operations completely destroyed Georgia's defenses, and by the fall, Tbilisi was captured. Protests against the invasion were irrelevant, as Russia controlled most of the strategic facilities in the region. At the same time, China took advantage of the power vacuum in Central Asia. Beijing signed agreements with key countries in the region, such as Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, offering economic aid and infrastructure investments in exchange for political and economic loyalty. This has allowed China to strengthen its strategic presence in a region where Russia's influence has been waning due to its focus on Europe. After seizing Georgia, Russia continued to put pressure on other Caucasus countries, such as Azerbaijan and Armenia. Russian troops established bases throughout the region, using it as a springboard to control oil routes and strategic resources. The Caucasus became completely dependent on the Kremlin, and any attempts by independent states to maintain their sovereignty were severely suppressed. Against the backdrop of global escalation, Russia continued to feel the growing impact of sanctions. Economic isolation led to a decline in living standards, rising inflation, and shortages of basic goods. It was increasingly difficult for the government to support military campaigns abroad, as the costs of maintaining the occupied territories and rebuilding the destroyed infrastructure were growing rapidly. This led to an even greater increase in protests and separatist sentiment in Russia's remote regions, such as the Far East and the Caucasus. Even Russia's closest allies began to question the Kremlin's ability to sustain its ambitions in the face of economic collapse. However, after capturing the Caucasus, Russia began to expand its influence in the Middle East. Syria, where Russia already had military bases, became another key region of Russian control. This led to increased tensions with Turkey, which felt threatened by its southern borders. In response, Turkey intensified its cooperation with NATO, leading to further militarization of the region and potential escalation of conflicts in Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon. After the victory in Ukraine and further expansion into Moldova and the Caucasus, the world is on the verge of a new global conflict. The United States and Western Europe, focused on their own problems, failed to stop Russia's aggression. NATO and the EU have lost their influence. This is a world where freedom is no longer the norm for many countries, including Ukraine, and resistance has become a struggle for survival. The deterioration of the situation in the world is not limited to the European theater of war. China has become a new hegemonic power in Asia, Africa, and even parts of Latin America. By exploiting the economic crisis and political destabilization in Europe and the United States, China has strengthened its influence on the world stage. Beijing has gradually emerged as a new global leader, causing concern in the United States and Europe, which have been forced to divert resources to confrontation on several fronts. What do you think about this alternative scenario? Do you think it is necessary to prevent such a scenario? Could the international community have prevented such events? What actions could have changed the course of history? Share your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more discussions.